LBC, I'm Simon English.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, very good evening. It's 8:02. I'm Iain Dale. Welcome to Tuesday's edition of Cross Question. The number to call if you'd like to put a question to our panel over the next hour is 0345 6060 973, and you can watch us on Global Player. With me, I have Dan Hodges, political commentator for The Mail on Sunday, Munira Wilson, Lib Dem MP for Twickenham, who's the party's education spokesperson. Jeevun Sandher is an economist at King's College London and a former Treasury official, and Robbie Moore is Conservative MP for Keighly. As I say, the number to call 0345 6060 973.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's go to our first caller. It's Alex in Watford. Alex, hi. What would you like to ask?
Good evening, Iain. Good evening, panel. Does the panel agree with suspending the Russian membership of the Security Council of the United Nations?
Dan Hodges, I'm not sure that that's even possible.
No, I don't actually think that is, but I think it is an interesting question because I think it does actually highlight that actually in what is one of the obviously major global crises, the United Nations is relatively impotent because obviously Russia has the veto on the Security Council. So I don't think that's relevant. We can't look to the UN to save us from this crisis. We have to look to the global community to save us from this crisis. I have to say, and I was up until today, I'd been quite impressed by the role Britain had been taking in this crisis and the role Boris had been taking in this crisis, right up until the point this afternoon when he stood up and actually, after some very strong and robust rhetoric over the last few days, and then announced what we were going to do. And it seemed to me that as we sit this evening, the British government's formal response to what Boris himself has been describing as the invasion of a sovereign state in Europe, the initiation of a crisis in Europe, a security crisis on a scale we haven't seen since the Second World War. We at the moment, the British government seems to be saying we think that the Champions League final should be removed from Russia, and that's it. And frankly, I mean, I think our initial response to the, practical response to this crisis has been staggeringly weak.
Robbie Moore, you're a Conservative MP. Were you in the chamber listening to the Prime Minister that you were this lunchtime? What was going through your head when you announced these measures?
Well, we're finding ourselves in a very serious situation, and what the Prime Minister has announced is sanctions against 5 principal banks, 3 high net worth individuals, which will have an impact on the Russian economy. One of those banks, from intelligence, is known to be dealing with around 70% of defence contracts through Russia, so it will have an impact. But of course, the measures that the Prime Minister announced today are in addition to what the support the government have already been given to the Ukrainian government at the request of the Ukrainian government.
What they are is just a repeat of what the Americans did, put sanctions on 4 years ago. They're not exactly very stringent, are they?
No, but the Prime Minister was crystal clear from the dispatch box today that
whenever
this is
a politician says the Prime Minister was very clear, we know that they're on weak territory. Can we get that agreed?
But he was clear in that this was the first step, and that he had no issue with putting in place much tougher measures, and I have no doubt that will happen in the days ahead.
It doesn't really equate to the cancellation of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, does it, which Germany have done? Because Britain, subliminally at least, has been quite critical of France and Germany, of their approach to this crisis, almost accusing them of appeasement. And now, when different countries take action, the Germans have trumped us, haven't they?
Well, the Germans have taken absolutely the right action, and the Prime Minister and the government recognised that and provided support to the German Chancellor in the position that they've taken on Nord Stream 2. And I agree it was the right decision for them
So
to
you're
have taken,
happy with the sanctions that have been introduced today? You don't think he should have gone further? Because a lot of your colleagues do. I talked to Alicia Kearns earlier. She certainly thinks he should have gone further.
Well, I absolutely think that this was the step in the right direction, and I absolutely will support much tougher measures being put in place further down the line, and I have no doubt that they will come. But the sanctions that have been put in place today, as I mentioned, against 3 high net worth individuals, against 5 principal banks, will have an impact. But I am absolutely sure that there will be further measures put in place down the line.
Munira Wilson.
Well, it won't surprise you to hear, given that you've just played an interview with my colleague Tim Farron, that I don't think the Prime Minister went anywhere near far enough.
Liberal Democrats normally split 3 ways on these issues.
No, well, I think we're at one on this, and we've been very clear for some time that we.
I'm
need
going to ban this word "clear" from these discussions.
Okay. We have been loud. We have been direct on the point about needing to go much further, much faster on sanctions. I welcomed the tone of the statement today, but I'm afraid the content did not follow the rhetoric. And as you've pointed out, Iain, those 3 individuals that have had sanctions brought against them have had sanctions against them from the US for some years. We need to be freezing and seizing the assets of all of Putin's cronies who are in London, commonly known as Londongrad, and really, because I think that will send a much stronger message and will hurt Putin. And we need to be bolstering our troop numbers. The fact that we've seen a cut in troop numbers, I think, puts us in a weaker position. And I should say that Liberal Democrats have actually been leading the way both in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords. My colleague Layla Moran has tabled a cross-party bill with support from people like Ian Duncan Smith and Chris Bryant right across the House, heavyweights who've been very strong on this point.
Well, she actually named a Russian oligarch today, didn't she?
Well, she used
Which I'd be grateful if you didn't name
No,
here.
I'm not going to name any of them, but she did use parliamentary privilege. I saw her speech just before I came here.
That's quite a serious thing to do, isn't it?
It is. But that list that has been provided by Navalny, I think, should be looked at very seriously by the British government. And I want to know why the list today hasn't gone much further. Those banks that were listed, they're not particularly significant. And I don't understand what hold individuals or companies have got over the government that they aren't going further, because Putin is a bully, and I think therefore we need to send a much stronger message back that we mean business, because at the moment I think he's making a laughing stock.
But how far do you go? Because the ultimate extreme would be to say, well, every either current or former Russian national who has got money in a British bank, we're going to sequester their assets. I mean, that's the extreme that you could go to. But that I mean, as a liberal, you would say that couldn't be fair, could it?
Well, look, for the oligarchs that are close to Putin, as I say, there are lists that we can be looking at and seizing, freezing and seizing those assets. I simply don't understand why the government isn't going there, because we know that would hurt Putin.
But you would have to divide them up, wouldn't you? Because there are some who've become British citizens who are clearly anti-Putin, very anti-Putin. I mean, would it be fair to sequester their assets?
No, but I'm assuming that there is intelligence available in terms of whose assets should be sequestered. And as I say, that we've got this compelling list that can be looked at, and I would hope that the government is looking at that. But we've also looked at the point I was making about Layla's cross-party bill around these shell companies where you can't follow the money. So there's a lot of talk about dirty money in London, and that's because we've got these oligarchs hiding behind these shell companies. This bill, which apparently the government has got legislation ready to go on this point, why it's not bringing this forward at this point, when Putin has already gone much further this afternoon than he had even last night. So the sanctions this morning are out of date.
As a vaguely competent chair of this discussion, I do need you to answer the question, though. Should Russia be suspended from the Security Council?
Well, like Dan, I'm not sure whether that's possible, but frankly, I think all diplomatic means should be on the table if there is any possibility, if in extremis.
Jeevun Sandher, first of all, your answer to the question, then I've got a couple of follow-ups for you.
Sure. So Russia can't be suspended from the UN Security Council. It also reflects a problem that we have, which is when major powers start to do things like this, start to invade other nations, it's very difficult for us to basically stop them. And we're living in a world that is clearly more dangerous, where there are going to be more conflicts. The peace we had in the post-90s, early 2000s has now very clearly disappeared. We're in a much more dangerous situation than we have been in my lifetime.
So, as an economist, are you sceptical about the value of sanctions, particularly when they're not very strong ones?
These sanctions, definitely so. Now, earlier, Robbie said these sanctions probably had some impact, and they did actually have some impact. What happened is the banks that weren't sanctioned saw their share value go up because they would not have sanctions on them. The other impact, of course, that if you're a Russian oligarch with any liquid asset in this country, you've moved it out. Today in the chamber, Boris Johnson said it was inevitable that we'd levy more sanctions. If it's inevitable, do it now. Do it right now.
So what you're saying is, by the fact that he hasn't done it now, anyone with half a brain would move their assets out of the country.
Of course they would. And sanctions historically haven't had a huge amount of impact. Iran was one place. Now, the problem is that Putin actually doesn't, if you like, govern in a way that sees the prosperity of his people or even those around him increase. He's doing it to stay in power. He wants to see Ukraine fail because he does not want to see a democracy succeed on his borders. But certainly there were lots and lots of measures that could have been taken today that weren't. Russia's foreign secretary has property in London, or we think he does, seize those properties. Russian oligarchs have their children in British schools, kick them out of those schools. And most importantly, there are over 200 Russian individuals who came here, who spent £2 million on visas, revoke their citizenship. If we can do that for Shamima Begum, a 15-year-old girl who joined ISIS, I fail to see why we can't do it for Russian billionaires.
Would there not be the mother of all legal battles over that sort of thing?
I mean, they already had the mother of all legal battles, but absolutely go for it and make it clear that when you invade another nation, that is completely unacceptable.
But if somebody's come here and got British citizenship, and to all intents and purposes has contributed to our society, maybe they've become a Conservative Party donor. Now, if they're anti-Putin and on the record as anti-Putin, I mean, that would be a bit rich, wouldn't it?
So I think in that case, you would be trying to target those who were pro-Putin, anyone who was closely tied to regime, but absolutely make it clear, this is a moment in history that is dangerous. The sovereignty of a nation has been violated. The peace we take for granted. This is not a small action. The only reason you should be violating the sovereignty of another nation is to stop a crime against humanity or a war crime. And that clearly doesn't constitute this case. He's violated democratic choice of the Ukrainian people.
So why do you think the government, and presumably the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary will have had advice from across government, this is really a question to all of you, why do you think the Prime Minister didn't go in more strongly today? There must be a reason, but I struggle to find what it is.
I think the Sunday Times reported that there were many donors who had, for the Conservative Party, we think are linked to Russian oligarchs. I'm not quite sure what the outcome was.
Can I just say, I think the answer to this actually comes back to the fundamental. I understand. I think this is one of the problems with Boris's response, as you've pointed out. The conspiracy theories about donations, etc., are just going to run amok.
I mean, we are going to come on to those.
Yeah, exactly. I think the fundamental reason actually is because Boris knows that the measures he outlined today aren't going to work. And he knows, or he certainly perceives, that Putin will ignore them and will advance further into the Ukraine, and then will advance further into the Ukraine. And he feels he has to have these additional measures in his arsenal. But it comes back to the fundamental point here. What is the actual objective of British and European and global foreign policy at the moment? Are we actually trying to prevent the invasion of a sovereign state, or are we just going through the motions? I mean, frankly, if let's take, for example, we've got a situation where Vladimir Putin has 160,000 armed troops, tanks, artillery, air power, is apparently preparing to go into the Ukraine to wipe a sovereign European state off the map, to implant his own regime, we're being told by British intelligence he has this hit list of people he's going to remove. Just imagine if Putin was looking at the debate we have just had. We've literally just sat here for the last 5 minutes having a debate about whether or not we should sanction 2 or 3 Russian individuals, maybe a few more individuals, maybe a few Russian companies. He's sitting there laughing at us.
Quite.
He is laughing at us.
I'll tell you what. Wouldn't make him laugh.
Absolutely laughing at us.
If NATO tomorrow said, "By the way, we're going to admit Ukraine now."
Exactly.
Wouldn't make
What
him
are we
laugh.
actually doing here? We are talking about things. We're debating things that we know won't work. I mean, can I just ask you a basic just a very simple question? Is what happened yesterday? Is that an invasion of the Ukraine? Can you answer that simple question?
Question to Robbie Moore.
Robbie, is that an invasion of the Ukraine? Does the British government regard that as an invasion of the Ukraine?
Well, I think
You can't, can you? You can't even answer, with the greatest respect, you can't even answer
the Prime
that simple
Minister,
question.
the Prime
We're trying
Minister
to
said it
deter
was
an invasion.
Why
And
can't
with the
you?
greatest respect, you can't even say if what happened yesterday was an invasion.
No, but what I can say is absolutely that
Right,
it was a trigger point that the Prime Minister has then...
You admit you can't even say if it was an invasion.
So it was a clear intention.
Was it an invasion?
Well...
Why can't you say yes? Because the Prime Minister said it was.
No, but I'm saying that you can't... we are trying to deter an invasion of the Ukraine. The Prime Minister said yesterday, this is an invasion, but you can't say that, can you?
No, I can absolutely say my view is from what was announced by President Putin it was a clear intention of him going forward.
But was it an invasion?
For an invasion of Ukraine?
No, but was what happened yesterday an invasion?
Why are you tying yourself up in knots on this? I mean, it either was or it wasn't, and the Prime Minister said it was. So why can't you?
Well, I've just said it. It was a clear
an invasion.
Yes, a
Fine.
clear intention,
Okay.
and that's why the mechanisms were announced at the dispatch box today.
Was it an invasion?
I've said yes.
It was an invasion, not an intention.
But why are you hesitant about it? I don't understand that.
But I've said yes. It was a clear.
After we've had to drag it out of you.
No, I was making the point that it's that is why the announcement was made at the dispatch box today, and what's been announced by the government for the sanctions that have been imposed. There has been a clear invasion from followed by the announcement that was made by Putin on state television yesterday of his intention going forward.
Can I just make this point? Right. So you've just said there was a clear invasion of a sovereign state that took place yesterday in Europe, right? What is the British government's response to an invasion of a sovereign state in Europe as we sit here this evening? Not what might we do at subsequent. What is our response this evening?
Well, so the response that has been announced today were sanctions against 5 banks, sanctions against 3 high net worth individuals,
sovereign
but
state,
all of the support that's been provided in already. So what we've already seen from the government is 22,000 troops being trained at the request of the Ukrainian government. We've had 2,000 anti-tank missiles being provided to the Ukrainian government.
That was our response.
Yeah. So as at today, you asked, this is the situation that we're in. We've also had 150 million pounds in aid that's been provided to the Ukrainian government, and $500,000 that's been provided as well. So that's as we are at today.
Right.
And I said that quite clear from the dispatch box. I'm sure the position will change in the days ahead.
You see, George has just tweeted, Vladimir Putin has got a cigar, smoking a cigar, listening to these weak Tories. But I'm going to put you out of your misery for a couple of minutes. At any rate, it's 8:20.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 23 minutes past 8 on LBC. With me in the studio, Robbie Moore, Conservative MP for Keighly, Munira Wilson, Lib Dem MP for Twickenham, Jeevun Sandher, who's an economist at King's College London, former Treasury official, and Dan Hodges, political commentator for The Mail on Sunday and interrogator extraordinaire, judging by the last few minutes. Chris is in Richmond. Hello, Chris.
Good evening, panel, and good evening, Ian. Should Boris Johnson be returning Conservative Party donations linked to Russian nationals?
Every Russian national?
Well, certainly. Well, I think so, potentially, yep.
OK, Jeevun Sandher.
I think definitely those who are linked to Vladimir Putin, certainly so. From every single Russian donor, I think it's actually a broader story about who is buying what access to the Conservative Party. I think on that point more broadly, though, what are we doing in the Ukraine? We're trying to stop an autocracy invade a democracy. And one difference between autocracies and democracies is autocracies lie to their people and democracies aren't supposed to. Democracies are supposed to serve the people. And in this country, we actually also face a much bigger problem, which is our government may have lied to us. It looks like our Prime Minister lied to us. And that fundamentally breaks down the contract between the governed and those who govern. And so really, I suppose today there's also a question here, specifically for you, Robbie. If it's found out
Don't you start.
Prime Minister, if it's found that the Prime Minister did host a party and did lie to Parliament and therefore lied to the British people...
I'm going to come to his rescue on this one because that is nothing to do with the question.
Okay.
I mean, somebody might ask that question later, but I'm not sure that's really relevant to this.
Fair enough.
Okay. Munira Wilson, let's go to you on this. I mean, your party's had its fair share of problems on political donations in the past, hasn't it? So is this not unique? I mean, maybe not on Russian ones, but it's not unique to the Tories.
No, look, unfortunately, the way our politics works, all political parties do rely on donations from individuals, and that's why we've called actually for a cap on donations. What I would say is, whilst in theory, I would like to see those any donations from Putin's cronies returned, I think the practicality of who do you return it to, how do you identify those individuals, actually makes it, in practical terms, quite difficult. So I'd like to see them ruling out taking future donations from some of his cronies. I mean, I think it's. I think we need to clean up our politics. The article in the Sunday Times at the weekend, which showed the Billionaires Club with Access, one of those actually was shown to be a close associate of Putin. And this person, along with several others, had access to the Prime Minister, his most senior advisors, to be able to influence and comment on COVID policy and various other elements of government policy. So coming back to the question we had earlier is why isn't the Prime Minister going further? I have to ask myself the question: who is donating to the Conservative Party, but also what pressure is being brought to bear by various companies that are here in the UK? And I'll give you one actually very clear example. I was speaking to Ed Davey, Lib Dem leader, today, who was telling me about when he was Energy Secretary in the coalition, he used powers that were available to him that hadn't been used before to stop a Russian investor coming and buying oil and gas assets in the North Sea, and actually the Conservatives who we were in coalition with were not very happy about this and tried to stop it, but he managed to get that through. Now, that suggests to me that there are other forces at work here, and therefore we do need to look very carefully at the donations.
Well, there is a donor, Alexander Tamerko, who's wanted to build some sort of pipeline from France to Britain, which Kwasi Kwarteng has stopped.
Yes.
And Penny Mordaunt, I think she's got a constituency interest in this. And he has... I'm going to be very careful what I say here for obvious reasons, but I mean, he has threatened her.
Really?
And you think this is a man who's donated a lot of money to the Tory party, and yet you've got the Secretary of State for Business and the International Trade Minister, Penny Mordaunt, actually stopping him from doing what he wants. I mean, the narrative here is that, oh, well, if you donate money, then you get what you want. Not always true, is it, Dan Hodges? But on the other hand, you've then got Boris Johnson's relationship with the Lib Dem family.
There are a couple of issues here. What I find fascinating is, I mean, we should not have a situation where any foreign national can donate to any British political party. I mean,
no, but they're not foreign. Anyone who does is a British citizen.
But that's the kind of implication of what we're saying. I think equally, And I just to balance this, we're talking about the influences on the Conservative Party. The reality is this is one of those, I was talking about this today, it's one of these bizarre issues where the left and the right align. We've got a situation where the leader of the former leader of the Labour Party is basically aligned with an organisation that is an apologist for.
He's not only aligned; he chairs it.
I was trying to be careful in my interpretation. So I think both the parties. But I come back to what I said today. I do think this is, we've talked about, the geopolitical implications of what Boris said today. There is domestic political implication to what Boris today. We are now going to get 3-4, we're going to get a week of just Tory Russian conspiracy theories on the basis of the Prime Minister's statement today. Now, I don't think the Prime Minister's statement was influenced in any way by donations to the Conservative Party. But you bet your bottom dollar, when we pick up our Sunday newspapers, there's going to be all sorts of, Russian donations. That conspiracy theory has now been let loose by Boris's failure to align his rhetoric with his policy statement today. But again, we've got to come back to the point. None of this is going to have the slightest influence over Putin and what Putin is going to do in the Ukraine. So I think we have to, the whole issue of funding of parties is something we need to look at. But I think we've got to try and get a united stance to this situation. But that unity can only come if the Prime Minister shows a lead. He obviously hasn't done today.
Robbie Moore, Evgeny Lebedev, who is the owner of the London Evening Standard, a very close ally of Boris Johnson's. His father, I don't think they've actually donated money to the Tory party. I stand to be corrected on that. But he's been to stay at his father's villa in Italy. Obviously, a very close relationship there. Evgeny Lebedev was put into the House of Lords by Boris Johnson. It is said that they have links to Putin. You can understand why people want to think the worst, can't you?
Well, yeah, of course you understand why people want to think the worst of these types of situations. But coming back to the original question that was asked, no foreign national is able to donate to a UK political party. And I've always actually said that actually the whole donation system needs much, even greater transparency that's attached to it because of we've seen, with the likes of the Labour Party and what's with political donations coming through other organisations from that've been linked to the Chinese, for example, recently in the headlines. But any donation that's given to a political party has to be registered, has to go through certain checks, and I do think there could be more transparency that's surrounded by that. But what I don't want to see over the days ahead is that the narrative that's picked up in the media to be around political donations and moved away from actually the situation that's on the ground in Ukraine at the moment. And coming back to what we were talking about with the sanctions that have been put in place, I want to reiterate that actually I think that we will see much tougher position taken going forward over the days ahead from the government as more information is understood, as more conversations happen with allies and their positions on this stance. So I think that's where we need to be focusing our attention at the moment.
Well, we're going to focus our attention on something away from Ukraine in just a moment. Everyone might be relieved to hear or not. And by the way, after 9, we're going to be talking about Russia Today. Keir Starmer today said that Russia Today, or RT as it likes to be known, should be banned in this country forthwith. Do you agree with him? That's what we're going to be talking about after 9. It's 8:33 on LBC. Simon English has the news headlines.
America has joined the UK and the European Union in imposing new sanctions on Russia. Joe Biden says there'll be restrictions on those described as elites and their relatives, as well as two financial institutions. Earlier, Moscow's upper house of parliament gave Vladimir Putin permission to use military force abroad. Meanwhile, the Kremlin is beginning to evacuate its diplomatic staff from Ukraine. Scotland has announced plans to end some coronavirus restrictions. The legal requirement to wear face masks in some settings will be scrapped from the 21st of March, but unlike England, there are no big changes to the testing system yet. And the weather, windy with showers across northern parts of the UK tonight. Clearer further south with frost in rural areas. A low of 4 degrees. Blustery showers in the north continuing through the morning. Some sunshine further south. Highs at 11 degrees.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
It's 8:37. Joe in Northwood says, Iain, really interesting listening to the panel on tonight, especially the excellent Dan Hodges. Can you have him on again, please?
Well, I think you should listen to that.
We've still got 23 minutes left. We'll make a judgment at the end of the programme, but I'm sure we will. Right, let me reintroduce you to the panel. Dan Hodges, political commentator for the Mail on Sunday. Jeevun Sandher is economist at King's College London and a former Treasury official. Munira Wilson, Lib Dem MP for Twickenham. She's the party's education spokesperson. And Robbie Moore is Conservative MP for Keighly. Chris is in Croydon. Hi, Chris.
Oh, good evening, Ian. Good evening, panel. My question is this. Can the existence of tax havens ever be justified?
Well, I've got to go to the Economist first, if only to give the others a couple of minutes to think, oh my God, how do I answer this question? Jeevun?
I don't think so, no, because what we see is, especially companies, the big multinationals, what do? So like Microsoft, before we had this deal at the G7, they shift their profits to a place like Bermuda. So they make their money in the United Kingdom, but they pretend that their profits are made in another country. And look, I'm sure Bermuda is a wonderful place, but I don't think that's where Microsoft is actually making their money. They're shifting that money abroad. And so really, the principle is very simple. Where companies do their business is where they should be taxed, apportionate by sales as to where they are. There's not really any benefit to anybody except those multinationals who are shifting taxation. And maybe in that case also to some extent Bermuda, but it does deprive huge amounts of tax revenue, not only from the United Kingdom, but of course other nations across the globe.
Munira?
Well, I largely agree with what Jeevun has said. Clearly, we can't dictate what another country's tax laws are, but we need to be able to find ways of where goods and services are made and provided in this country, they ought to be taxed as far as possible in this country.
We have done that with Amazon, haven't we? Because they used to be domiciled in Luxembourg, and so they didn't have to pay so much VAT, I think. But I think that has changed now, so it's possible to do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a tax expert, sadly.
Me neither.
But where it is possible, I would like to see the government taking, greater efforts on this point, in terms of tackling tax evasion and use of tax havens.
Robbie?
Well, I would say that actually where goods and services are utilised or moved for a certain country, there should be mechanisms in place where tax can apply appropriately to the goods and services that are impacting on that community, on that country. And again, we've got very limited ability to impose and influence tax law, tax regimes in other countries, but where we've got the ability to impose a system a tax system in this country where we are able to draw down revenue from goods and services that are utilised within our domestic framework, then that should be able to be done.
George Osborne, when he was Chancellor, he did, I think, try to get an international consensus on doing something on this, but it seems to have dropped off the political agenda recently.
Oh, and that's probably because the political agenda's been pretty busy over the last 20 months or so. But and it doesn't mean to say that can't be revitalised. But I think the challenge will be trying to trigger that consensus. And I know that George Osborne, when he was Chancellor, tried to do that, and that it unfortunately takes time. And actually getting enough countries where those goods and services are traded from to come to an agreement is likely to be difficult. But it doesn't mean to say that it can't try.
Okay.
It can't try
Just
and achieve
we
it.
did have a tax deal at the G7, right? A 50% minimum corporation tax and a levy of those very profitable multinationals where they do their business if their profit margin is high enough. So it wasn't everything that we wanted it to be, but it certainly was a step in the right direction. It was actually one thing which was a huge bonus from that G7 meeting.
Okay, Dan?
It's not going to be a popular answer, but yes, we can justify it if there are countries that establish tax regimes that international companies want to utilise, then they have a right to utilise them. It's the same as in this country. We don't expect countries who operate in this country to pay more tax than we legally ask them to pay, and I'm not entirely sure how we can expect companies to pay more tax in other jurisdictions than they are legally.
But what about the argument that Jeevun just made about the fact that surely you should be taxed in the country that you're operating in?
That's fine, and if we can find a legal way to ensure companies do that, and a robust legal framework to ensure companies do that, I would support that. But in the absence of that, what are we saying? We're saying companies should pay some sort of voluntary, some arbitrary voluntary level of taxation that goes beyond what they're legally required to pay. I mean, with the greatest respect, I'm not going to pay anything beyond what I am legally required to pay in terms of tax. Is anybody around this table going to do that?
Jeevun?
Well, I pay as much tax as is levied upon me, of course. But in terms of, how this works, I think we're actually in agreement, right? Companies should be taxed where they sit. The G7 made a huge stride towards that direction. The worry isn't that they're going to try and grab more money off you. It's that actually tax revenue that should be going somewhere isn't going somewhere. So yes, also true in the United Kingdom, but specifically in countries abroad as well. You have a huge mining company. It says it's buying intellectual property from another jurisdiction somewhere else. All of a sudden, those low-income nations are being deprived of huge amounts of tax revenue. So it's not about going into another country and saying, by the way, guys, we'll be taking some of that cash. It's about saying where you make your money, that's where you end up being taxed. And that's the real kind of a good move forward by the G7. I'm glad that we've moved towards it.
And just to Dan's point, I think there is a point about corporate responsibility, and I think consumers are getting much, much more savvy about where they buy their goods and services from. And so, yes, of course, most companies will want to try and save as much money as possible. But I think actually increasingly you find companies do want to do the right thing because they know that it gives them a competitive advantage. And there are, surprisingly enough, there are high net worth individuals out there who will do the right thing. I mean, although I say I'm not a tax expert, I should confess, as a graduate, I did spend 3 years working at one of the big accountancy firms where I was starting to train in tax consultancy, working on the tax. Yes, I did. Yeah, I was bored out of my mind, and I got involved in politics instead. But there I was being asked to help complete the tax returns of very famous artists, entertainers, sports people. I probably best not say on air. And there were some who were trying to use the rules to their benefit as much as possible to try and avoid paying as much tax as possible. But there were actually some big names, notable exceptions, who said, no, this country has helped me to be successful and wealthy. I will pay my dues into the British Exchequer for the benefit of British people. And I'd like to see more companies taking that stance because I'm more likely to be drinking their coffee or using their services if they are paying their tax.
No, that's right, and they fantastic. But to answer the question, it is legitimate to pay the amount of tax that you're legally required to pay, isn't it?
Yes, that's legitimate, but that's where it comes back to closing those loopholes, because a lot of these big companies and wealthy individuals will pay big companies like the one I was working for to find all sorts of tax wheezes to get them out paying tax.
But until those loopholes, we talk about loopholes, those loopholes of the law, until we close those loopholes, it is legitimate to pay the amount of tax.
And I think we're all in agreement saying that we need to work internationally to close those loopholes.
Yeah, all right, well, thank you very much all for your answers. We've got 15 more minutes. If you'd like to ask our panel a question, 0345 6060 973. It's 8:46.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
It's 8:49 on LBC. Robbie Moore, Munira Wilson, Jeevun Sandher and Dan Hodges here to answer your questions. We have got a brilliant fun text question at the end, so don't switch off before then. Brenda is in St Ives first, though. Hello, Brenda.
Good evening, Ian. Good evening,
Hello.
panel. My question is to you. As President Trudeau has just won the vote...
Prime Minister.
President Trudeau has just won the vote to pass his emergency powers. Do you believe he's the modern-day Mugabe? And if so, should Canada be removed from the Commonwealth?
Wow. Well, it is quite extraordinary. I mean, I haven't followed this very closely, but some of the powers that he has taken upon himself, bearing in mind that he's the Prime Minister of Canada, not the President, but also the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. Munira, I'm going to come to you as a fellow Liberal. And somebody
How did I guess you were going to come to me
somebody who
first?
presumably, like all British political women, seem to love Justin Trudeau for very shallow reasons.
Oh, that's a little unfair.
I mean, it's quite extraordinary what he's up to, isn't it?
Yeah, well, like you, I confess I haven't followed it in detail, but I know there have been protests about COVID restrictions.
Truckers,
is that right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, as a Liberal, I personally do feel uncomfortable with these swinging measures being taken to shut down these people. And as you know, here through the COVID pandemic, we as Liberals have argued against things like COVID passports and so on. However, clearly if there is misinformation being touted by some of these people, whether it's about vaccination or that they're trying to defy restrictions, clearly some action needs to be taken. But I do feel a bit uncomfortable if there are all sorts of swinging actions being taken. I'm sorry, I haven't followed it closely.
I actually want short answers from you on this, because if you do give short answers, we can fit in another question from one of Robbie's constituents.
Ooh. Okay.
Sandy.
Trudeau hasn't handled this well, is the long and story short of it. He has demonised the protesters and now these emergency powers, and the real danger is that he's begun to politicise what is vaccine uptake. Like in this country, one of the really good news stories isn't just the fact that we vaccinated a huge proportion of the population, but also the fact that it's not been politicised. The rates between Conservatives and Labour are pretty similar. In the United States, one of the biggest predictors of are you getting your vaccine is are you a Democrat or are you a Republican? And Trudeau's actually driven them towards that moment. You want to drive up vaccine rates, you don't do it by insulting people, and you don't do it with these measures either.
Robbie.
Well, I think the measures that Prime Minister Trudeau has implemented is not fair at all. And actually, again, when you look at the vaccine uptake that we've had in this country, 83% of adults now have been triple jabbed. There are other mechanisms of encouraging people to follow the programme to be able to then release all restrictions altogether. And I think part of the first question was should Canada be removed from the Commonwealth?
Yes.
Well, I think, crikey, absolutely not. I mean, I think that's then deeply unfair
Brenda is
to all of
likening
those
Justin Trudeau to Robert Mugabe.
Okay, that's a bit extreme.
It's a bit extreme, and I think completely unfair to many of the...
I'm not sure it is on this, though, that given the nature of the measures that he's taken against the protesters, against the truckers, and now introducing this new law, I think the comparison can be made.
Yeah, but I was talking about actually removing Canada from the Commonwealth, I think, is the extreme element.
But Zimbabwe from the Commonwealth,
but I do think that the measures that that Trudeau is implementing is way beyond
Dan.
too far.
No, I completely agree with what he's doing. I think he's enforcing the rule of law. I think the protesters have had, 3 weeks in which they've been disrupting Canada in an illegal way.
But shutting down their bank accounts?
I think if
you agree with that?
Yeah, I think
really.
Yes, absolutely. I think the balance, and we've seen it in this country. I think the balance between protest and illegality is going the wrong way, and the people who I've seen it over the last couple of days and weeks suddenly being outraged against the actions he's taking are exactly the same people who, in relation to, say, the action that Extinction Rebellion have taken in this country, or Black Lives Matter protesters have taken this country in the United States, have been demanding sending in the army, have been demanding the most rigorous measures. So I think it's absolutely right. The rule of law has to be enforced.
But Dan, that would also mean that when the Chinese clear their protesters in much more violent ways by following what you would call the rule of law, that would also be justified. The question is not, are these powers founded in law? Of course they are. What I'm saying, Dan, is that if the justification is the rule of law, what you are saying is justified because it is legal. What I'm saying to you is actually that's not really the key issue. The key issue is, are these egregious offences against liberty?
Fine. Then let's reverse that argument, and let's say because the Chinese abuse the rule of law, we shouldn't have to respect the rule of law in this country. So that's not what I'm saying, Dan. What I'm saying to you is that's the implication of what you were saying.
No, the issue is that the fact that they're following the law isn't the issue. The question is, are Justin Trudeau's actions, irrespective of whether or not it is justified?
All right. Well, do you think there should be a situation where we would allow people to blockade the streets outside this studio for 3 weeks with impunity?
I don't think we should let them blockade it, but I do think
neither does Justin Trudeau, and Justin Trudeau is implementing measures to ensure that doesn't happen.
But he probably wouldn't close down people's bank accounts.
I wouldn't close down their bank accounts.
Well, but how effective have our measures been today in terms of keeping our roads clear and keeping this disruption to a minimum in this country? It hasn't succeeded, and you, Iain, know very well from when you've dealt with this issue in relation to protesters about other issues, that people have been outraged and have been turning around saying, why isn't the government doing it? Why isn't Priti Patel dealing with this? Why are we letting these people blockade our streets?
I think there are ways to deal with it and ways not to deal with it. Brenda, thank you very much indeed. Final question from Sukhdeep in Keighly. Sukhdeep, the floor is yours.
Thank you. This is something that's been playing on my mind as a GP in a city practice. I unfortunately regularly look after women who have been sexually assaulted, either recently or in the past. Rape reporting to the police is at the highest it's ever been, over 60,000 in the last year. And the proportion of those that go on to someone being charged is lower than it has ever been, at 1.3%. In my mind, I find it very difficult now to talk to these women about talking to the police, because I worry about opening them up to further victimhood. The Victims Commissioner has said...
I'm going to have to hurry you, Sukhdeep. I need your question, because we're near the end of the programme.
The Victims Commissioner has said that in this country she's worried that we've effectively legalised rape. How do the panellists think we've come to this point, and what would they do about it?
Robbie.
Well, I think it's deeply concerning what we've just heard, and there has to be much better relationship between where cases are identified and the individuals that have been subject to this horrific abuse in these situations have access to whether it's their GP or other channels to be able to talk about it, describe it, and then that individuals, as we've just heard from the listener, a constituent of mine, don't feel that the system doesn't allow them to be able to go and talk quite openly to the police for them to be able to put the right support mechanisms in place. But
we had the Director of Public Prosecutions on the radio this morning trying to explain away this 1.3% conviction rate and saying, obviously things have got to change. We've been having these discussions for years and years, and things are getting worse.
Yeah, and I don't, and then clearly the last 20 months or so has not helped at all, because I suspect there are cases that have gone unnoticed as well, and there will be, so the data that we're probably looking at isn't as accurate as we would normally expect it to be, which worries me as well. So, but I do think that there's got to be more emphasis on this and making sure that the channels and lines of communication between organisations where initial reporting is done and victims feel that they are able to have trust installed back in those organisations needs to be there.
Munira.
Well, the the conviction rate is just woeful, absolutely woeful, and my heart breaks.
I've got to ask you to be quite brief.
So I think that it clearly needs much more in terms of resources, particularly for specialist officers to be able to be looking into these cases, and also a culture change right across the police, starting with the Met Police here in London, and also we need far better support services for victims of rape. Actually, I was in a debate last week on young people's mental health, and Jess Phillips, with her characteristic passion, talked about a young woman who suffered sexual abuse, was raped 5 years ago, and still can't access counselling or support. That's just shocking. So we need resources and culture change.
Dan?
Again, not a popular view. I would change the legal standards so that we move beyond. I know this is not strictly literally what it is, but it's broadly what it is. I'd move in relation to rape cases beyond the standard where it is beyond reasonable doubt to a balance of probability standard. And that's what I do. Because I think we have to do something.
Jeevun.
More resources and reform in the Met.
Very admirably brief, if I may. So you can come back. In fact, you can all come back. But before you do, I want you to answer this text from Denise in Brighton. BBC journalists Emily Maitlis and John Sopel have announced they're leaving to join LBC. Who should LBC pinch next? And given that we've Sheila Fogarty, Eddie Mayer, Andrew Marr, plus Emily Maitlis and John Sopel, is this a takeover bid? Who should we pinch next, Robbie?
Well, I am a big fan of Chris Mason, but why not have Esther and Philip from GB News as well? They could come and join you.
When I said you could all come back, Jeevun.
I reckon Ant and Dec.
Well, they're not on the BBC, are
in
they?
drag.
Oh, but you can bring them over still, though. You guys have got.
They could do a good favour.
Great roster.
Do you want them in drag, as they were at the weekend?
I want them to wear whatever they feel comfortable in.
Well, I'm a big fan of Michelle Hussein. And I think she'd give some of your interviewees a serious run for their money, just like you do, Iain.
Thank you. Dan?
I don't think anyone, Iain. I think you're doing a fantastic job. I think you should stick at it.
He's definitely coming back.
I intend to for as long as they'll have me. Dan Hodges, Munira Wilson, Jeevun Sandher and Robbie Moore, thank you very much indeed for joining us. In a moment, we're going to be talking about whether Russia Today should be banned. 0345 6060 973. It's 1 minute past 9.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the US is sending around 800 troops and 20 helicopters to the Baltic region over concerns about a Russian invasion of Ukraine. This evening, Joe Biden has announced the first wave of sanctions against Russia. The American president is warning Moscow it'll pay an even steeper price if it continues with what he's described as its aggression. Britain and the EU have also announced restrictions after troops from Moscow moved into 2 regions in the former Soviet state. Vladimir Putin insists they're part of peacekeeping duties. But Joe Biden thinks his Russian counterpart is preparing for a full attack after breaking international law.
Who in the Lord's name does Putin think gives him the right to declare new so-called countries on territory that belong to his neighbors?
Well, meanwhile, UEFA is likely to switch this season's Champions League final away from St. Petersburg due to the crisis. The body says it's closely monitoring the situation after Boris Johnson joined calls for it to be moved. Major incidents have been declared in Worcestershire and Shropshire as water levels along the River Severn continue to rise. Severe flood warnings, meaning a danger to life, have been issued for Ironbridge and Bewdley, where temporary flood defences could be breached. Communities are calling for a permanent solution to what they say is becoming increasingly frequent flooding. Michael Boddice lives in Bewdley.
I just feel sorry for the people down here because they will be just watching it second by second and seeing it creep into the houses. And it's not just water. You know, the sewerage that comes up from the drains and stuff, it's not just water, it's disgusting and it stinks.
Scotland's last coronavirus restrictions will